Alright, buckle up, because we're about to take a wild ride back to one of the most jaw-dropping civilizations that ever walked this earth. We're talking about the Sumerians. And no, I don't mean some dusty textbook version of history. I mean the real deal. The original hustlers, the OG innovators, the people who basically invented civilization as we know it. Sound too bold? Stick around, because by the end of this, you're going to be wondering why nobody taught you this stuff in school. So picture this. It's around 2500 BC. The world is a wild, untamed place. Most of humanity is still figuring out how to grow food without starving. But down in a sliver of land between two mighty rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, a group of people called the Sumerians have already cracked the code. They've got cities. Real cities. They've got trade networks stretching for thousands of miles. They've got technology so advanced for their time that it makes you wonder, how in the world did they pull all this off? And honestly, doesn't that just blow your mind a little? Let me paint you a picture of what Sumer looked like in the 2500s BC. You've got cities like Uruk, Lagash, and Nippur. Sprawling urban centers with tens of thousands of people living, working, arguing, trading, and building. These weren't just villages. These were the New Yorks and Londons of the ancient world. And they were buzzing with energy, with commerce, with invention. Now here's the thing that gets me every time. These people didn't have Google. They didn't have computers. They didn't have calculators. They didn't have any of the stuff we take for granted every single day. And yet, they engineered systems that would make a modern civil engineer raise an eyebrow and say, okay, respect. So let's get into it. Let's talk about the technology first, because this is where things get really spicy. Now, you've probably heard that the Sumerians invented the wheel. And yeah, that's basically true. Or at least they were among the first to really use it in a sophisticated way. But here's the thing most people don't know. The first wheels weren't used for transportation. The first wheels were used for pottery. Yeah, the potter's wheel came before the wagon wheel. Think about that for a second. The Sumerians were spinning clay into perfectly shaped vessels long before anybody thought to put a wheel under a cart. And when they finally figured out that wheels could move stuff around, game over. The whole logistics game changed overnight. By the 2500s BC, wheeled carts were being used throughout Sumer to move goods, materials, and supplies across the flat Mesopotamian plains. And because the land between the rivers is basically as flat as a pancake, no mountains, no major forests, the wheel was absolutely revolutionary. It's like the moment somebody figured out you could use the internet not just to send emails, but to run an entire business. That kind of shift. That kind of energy. Does that give you chills? Because it should. Okay, so here's the deal. Mesopotamia, which literally means land between the rivers, sounds like paradise, right? Two big rivers, plenty of water, fertile soil. And in some ways, yeah, it was. But nature, as always, had a sense of humor. The Tigris and Euphrates flooded unpredictably. And when you're trying to grow food for a city of 30,000 people, unpredictable is not the vibe you want. So what did the Sumerians do? They didn't just adapt to the environment, they straight up engineered their way around it. They built one of the most sophisticated irrigation systems the ancient world had ever seen. We're talking a network of canals, levees, reservoirs, and sluice gates that could redirect water exactly where it needed to go, when it needed to go there. They turned a landscape that could easily flip from flood to drought into a reliable agricultural machine. And here's the kicker. These weren't simple ditches dug with a stick. These were carefully planned, carefully maintained waterways that required coordination between entire communities. You needed labor, you needed management, you needed record keeping, you needed someone to make sure the water was distributed fairly. And that level of organization, that's what pushed the Sumerians towards something even bigger: government, administration, and eventually, writing. You ever stop and think that something as unglamorous as a water canal might have led to the invention of writing? I mean, come on. If that's not the butterfly effect in real life, I don't know what is. Alright, here's where we hit the mother lode. The single most important invention in human history, and yeah, I'll stand by that, came from Sumer. We're talking about writing. Specifically, a system called cuneiform. Now, cuneiform didn't pop up out of nowhere. It started as a practical solution to a very practical problem. See, when you're running a city-state with a complex economy, tracking grain, livestock, trade goods, labor, taxes, you can't just keep everything in your head. You need records. And at first, the Sumerians used simple picture symbols pressed into clay tablets. A circle with lines radiating out meant sun. A simplified drawing of a head meant person. Basic stuff. But over time, and this is the genius part, those pictograms evolved into abstract symbols that represented sounds rather than objects. That's the leap. That's when writing stopped being just a bookkeeping tool and started being a vehicle for language, for literature, for law, for everything. By the 2500s BC, Sumerian scribes were recording everything. Contracts, hymns, lists of kings, myths, legal codes, business deals. And they were doing it on small clay tablets using a reed stylus to press wedge-shaped marks into wet clay. That's what cuneiform means, by the way, from the Latin cunos, meaning wedge. Wedge writing doesn't exactly have the same ring as the invention that changed everything. But hey, what are you gonna do? And get this, we still have hundreds of thousands of these clay tablets today, preserved in museums around the world. Scholars are still translating them, still discovering new things about what the Sumerians were thinking, worrying about, celebrating, and arguing over 4,500 years ago. Honestly, how does that not send a shiver down your spine? Now let's talk metal, because this is where the Sumerians really started flexing. By the 2500s BC, Sumerian craftsmen had mastered the art of working with copper and bronze. And this wasn't just about making pretty jewelry. Although yeah, they made stunning jewelry too. This was about tools, weapons, agricultural implements, architectural hardware, the whole 9 yards. Bronze, which is an alloy of copper and tin, was the high-tech material of the ancient world. It was harder and more durable than pure copper, and it held a sharper edge. For farming, for construction, for craftsmanship, bronze tools were a game changer. It's kind of like the difference between using a flip phone and a smartphone. Same basic concept, but one is just on a completely different level. But here's the twist, and this is where trade becomes absolutely critical. Mesopotamia had almost no natural metal deposits. None. Zero. The land between the rivers was rich in agriculture, but when it came to raw materials like copper, tin, silver, gold, and stone, Sumer was basically sitting on empty. So how did they build a bronze-based economy with no local metals? Simple. They became the greatest traders of the ancient world. Okay, this is the part of the story that I think is genuinely underrated. When people talk about ancient trade, they think of spices in the Middle Ages or Silk Roads in Asia. But the Sumerian trade network in 2500 BC was already operating at a scale and sophistication that would have blown most people's minds. Think about this. Sumerian merchants were trading with civilizations all across the ancient Near East and beyond. We're talking about trade routes that stretched from the Indus Valley, what's now Pakistan and India, all the way west into Anatolia, which is modern-day Turkey, and south down into the Arabian Peninsula and the Persian Gulf. And this wasn't just simple barter. This was organized, professional, bureaucratically managed trade. There were merchant houses, called Tamkarum in Sumerian, who operated almost like ancient banks and trading companies. There were formal contracts written on clay tablets recording loans, interest rates, trade agreements, and partnerships. There were standardized weights and measures to make sure everyone was playing fair. There were dedicated trade routes with weigh stations where merchants could rest, restock, and get their goods inspected. And there was a whole class of professional traders, kind of like the middle management of the ancient world, who made their living facilitating commerce between Sumer and its partners. Now, does that sound like a primitive society to you? Because I gotta say, it sounds pretty dang sophisticated to me. What do you think? Would you have survived as a merchant on those ancient trade routes? Because I'll be honest, I'm not so sure I would have. Let me break down the economics, because this is genuinely fascinating stuff. Sumer had a few things in absolute abundance. Agricultural products, grain, barley, dates, wool, and textiles. They also had a highly developed craft industry producing pottery, leather goods, and worked metal objects. And they had something that every trading partner wanted: administrative know-how. Sumerian scribes and merchants were so organized that their accounting practices and contracts were respected far beyond the borders of Mesopotamia. But Sumer needed a lot too. Metal, copper from Oman and Cyprus, tin from as far away as Afghanistan and Anatolia. Timber, because the Mesopotamian plains are flat and treeless, so they were importing cedar from Lebanon. Stone for building and statues, since the river delta doesn't produce good quarry rock. And luxury goods: lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, carnelian from the Indus Valley, gold from various sources, exotic shells from the Persian Gulf. The Sumerians were essentially running a massive import-export operation, trading their agricultural surplus and manufactured goods for the raw materials they needed to build their civilization. It's the same basic logic as modern international trade, just 4,500 years earlier. And here's the wild part. You want to know how we know all this? Because the Sumerians wrote it all down. Every shipment, every deal, every debt, every trade dispute, all of it, pressed into clay, fired and preserved for millennia. Can you believe that? 4,500 years later, we're still reading their receipts. That's next-level record-keeping, right there. Now you might be wondering, how did they actually move all these goods around? And this is another area where the Sumerians really showed out. The answer, in large part, was water. The Tigris and Euphrates weren't just a source of agricultural water. They were the highways of the ancient world. And the Sumerians were expert boat builders and navigators. They used a variety of watercraft, from simple reed boats for local river travel to larger wooden vessels for longer journeys and heavier cargo. The Persian Gulf was a major trade corridor, with Sumerian ships sailing down to Dilmun, modern-day Bahrain, which served as a kind of ancient free trade port, and from there to Magan in Oman, and even to the distant land of Meluha, which is what they called the Indus Valley civilization. Now think about that. These were open water voyages in wooden boats, navigating by stars and coastal landmarks, carrying tons of cargo, thousands of miles from home. In 2500 BC, without GPS, without radio, without any safety net whatsoever. Okay, I consider myself a pretty adventurous person, but that's a level of guts I genuinely respect. Doesn't that make you appreciate your air-conditioned commute just a little bit more? Let me hit you with something that'll really make your head spin. The Sumerians were absolute math nerds. And I mean that in the most respectful way possible. They developed a numerical system based on the number 60, what we call the sexagesimal system. And before you go 60, that's a weird number to build a math system around. Just remember that 60 is why we have 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, and 360 degrees in a circle. Yeah, that's the Sumerian legacy, still running quietly in the background of your daily life, every single day. Why 60? Because 60 is divisible by a whole bunch of numbers. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30. That makes it incredibly useful for doing fractions and divisions without messy remainders. For a civilization doing complex calculations involving grain rations, land measurements, and trade volumes, a highly divisible base number was a genuine practical advantage. The Sumerians also developed sophisticated geometric and algebraic techniques. They could calculate areas and volumes, solve what we'd recognize as quadratic equations, and work with multiplication tables, reciprocal tables, and complex division. We know this because we have the clay tablets, hundreds of them, that served as math textbooks and student exercises in Sumerian schools. And astronomy? Sumerian astrologer priests were carefully observing and recording the movements of the sun, moon, planets, and stars. They tracked lunar cycles to create calendars and were laying the groundwork for astronomical traditions that would eventually feed into Greek science, and from there, into the modern scientific tradition. So the next time you check the time on your phone or look up at a night sky, just know, somewhere in that chain of human discovery, the Sumerians are in there, watching the stars, writing it all down on clay. Wild, right? Doesn't that just hit different? Here's something that might surprise you. In ancient Sumer, religion and economics were completely intertwined. The temple wasn't just a place of worship. It was literally the economic engine of the city. The great temple complexes of Sumer functioned as massive institutions. They owned land. They employed workers, farmers, weavers, potters, scribes, administrators. They stored surplus grain. They organized trade expeditions. They distributed food to the population. They ran what was essentially the largest enterprise in the city-state. And at the head of all this was the temple administration, priests and scribes who kept meticulous records of everything that flowed in and out of the storerooms. This wasn't just spiritual leadership, this was executive management. These people were running a corporation, just wrapped in religious authority. And honestly, when you think about it, it makes perfect sense. In a world without a separate government bureaucracy, someone has to organize large-scale economic activity. The temple, with its authority and administrative infrastructure, was perfectly positioned to do it. Let me take a moment to talk about one of the most remarkable archaeological discoveries ever made, something called the Royal Standard of Ur. Because this single artifact tells us more about Sumerian technology and trade than almost anything else we've ever found. The Royal Standard of Ur was discovered in the 1920s in the Royal Cemetery at Ur. It's a wooden box, about 20 inches long, decorated with an elaborate mosaic made from shells, lapis lazuli, and red limestone. On one side, you have a scene of war. On the other, a scene of peace and celebration. Farmers bringing livestock, craftsmen carrying goods, musicians playing at a royal banquet. And here's the kicker. The lapis lazuli in that mosaic came from Afghanistan. The shells came from the Persian Gulf. The red limestone came from somewhere else entirely. That single artifact, that decorative box sitting in a royal tomb in Ur, is itself a physical manifestation of the trade network the Sumerians had built. It literally embodies, in its materials, the reach and sophistication of their commercial connections. You want a gut punch of historical reality. That box is sitting in the British Museum right now. You could go see it. You could stand in front of it and look at materials that traveled thousands of miles, on boats, on carts, on the backs of donkeys, to end up in a tomb in ancient Iraq. 4,500 years ago. I don't know about you, but that kind of thing gives me chills every single time. For real, how does that not just knock you sideways? I want to take a step back and talk about the actual human beings who built all of this. Because it's easy to say the Sumerians as if they were some abstract historical force. But they weren't. They were people. Complicated, messy, brilliant, ordinary people. We know from cuneiform texts that Sumerian society had a complex social hierarchy. At the top were the king and the temple elites. Below them were free citizens, farmers, craftsmen, traders, soldiers. And at the bottom were people who had fallen into debt bondage or been captured in conflict. But within that hierarchy there was surprising complexity. Women in Sumer had legal rights. They could own property, conduct business, and manage their own affairs. There were female merchants and scribes. There were women who ran temple businesses and their own commercial enterprises. This wasn't a society where half the population was simply invisible. And these were real people with real lives and real frustrations. We know from clay tablets that Sumerian students complained about homework, that merchants argued about unfair partners, that farmers grumbled about bad harvests, that workers organized to demand fair treatment. Sound familiar? Because it should. People are people, across time and across space. The technology changes, the language changes, but the basic human experience, the ambition, the frustration, the joy, the striving, that doesn't change. And honestly, I find that deeply comforting. Like, no matter how chaotic the modern world feels, we are part of a very long story. A story that started in a flat land between two rivers, where remarkably resourceful human beings decided to build something that had never existed before. What do you reckon? If you could drop into ancient Ur for just one day, what would you want to see first? The market? The temple? The harbor? Because I already know my answer, and it's the harbor. Every single time. So where does all of this leave us? What's the real takeaway from the story of Sumerian technology and trade in the 2500s BC? Here's what I think. And tell me if this resonates. The Sumerians weren't special because they had some magical advantage nobody else had. They were special because they solved problems. Practical, urgent, everyday problems. And in the process of solving those problems, they invented systems and technologies and institutions that changed the course of human history. The wheel wasn't invented because someone was trying to make history. It was invented because moving heavy stuff is really hard, and somebody figured out that a circular object could make it easier. Writing wasn't invented because someone wanted to create literature. It was invented because tracking grain inventories is complicated, and somebody figured out that marks on clay could keep it straight. Trade networks weren't built because someone had a grand vision of global commerce. They were built because Sumer needed copper and tin and timber, and somebody figured out that if you had something other people wanted, you could get what you needed in return. Innovation, in other words, is fundamentally about necessity, about human beings looking at a problem and refusing to accept that it can't be solved. And in that sense, the Sumerians were just like us. Like every human being who has ever looked at an obstacle and thought, yeah, but what if we tried this? That's the Sumerian spirit, and it's alive in every engineer, every entrepreneur, every craftsman, every farmer, every teacher who has ever looked at the world and decided to make it a little better, a little smarter, a little more connected. All right, we've covered a lot of ground today, from the potter's wheel to the cuneiform tablet, from the irrigation canals of the Euphrates to the trade ships of the Persian Gulf, from the mathematical genius of the sexagesimal system to the economic powerhouse of the Sumerian temple. We've talked about real people, merchants and scribes and farmers and craftsmen, who built something extraordinary out of flat land, river water, and sheer human ingenuity. And we've seen how, at a time when most of the world was still figuring out the basics, the Sumerians were already running a globalized, technology-driven, commercially sophisticated civilization. So the next time somebody tells you ancient history is boring, and I genuinely cannot imagine how anyone could say that after all this, just remember the Sumerians. Remember that civilization didn't just happen. Someone built it. Someone figured it out, step by step, problem by problem, tablet by tablet. And the fact that we can still read their words, still see their artifacts, still trace their trade routes 4,500 years later, that is the ultimate flex. That is legacy on a level that none of us will probably ever match. But hey, you got to start somewhere. Thanks for hanging with me today. If this blew your mind even a little bit, and come on, how could it not? Do yourself a favor and dive deeper, because the story of Sumer is just the beginning. And the deeper you go, the more you realize that human history is the greatest story ever told. And we're all part of it. Catch you on the next one.